What's the most horrible way to die that you've ever heard of that has actually happened? Story 1. Since someone already mentioned scaphism, my second worst one is strychnine poisoning. It can be inhaled, consumed, or absorbed through wet tissue like the nose, mouth, or eyes. It causes the voluntary nervous system to go into overdrive, making every muscle in the body contract and spasm uncontrollably. These spasms can be so strong that they tear muscles from the bone. If untreated, death usually occurs within 2 to 3 hours, either from asphyxiation, when the chest muscles spasm so hard the ribs cannot expand, or from sheer exhaustion. There is no antidote to strychnine, but if caught immediately, a person can be placed in sensory deprivation and given massive doses of muscle relaxants. If they survive the first 24 hours, they usually recover. Usually. Story 2. I once saw a video of someone who had taken their own life using rat poison, probably found it on WPD, and I'll never forget it. The person was hunched over, with blood pouring from their nose and mouth, but still very conscious, head in hands, visibly suffering. Over time, due to blood loss and the effects of the poison, they started looking delirious. Eventually, they leaned back where they were sitting, with blood continuing to leak from them, everywhere. I believe rat poison thins the blood. After a while, they began convulsing, most likely going into cardiac arrest. The whole thing was long, drawn out, and agonizing to watch. At some point, someone approached, possibly to check if they were okay, but quickly backed away. It must have been one of the worst ways to go, likely a desperate choice made without fully understanding the poison's effects. It was just horrific. Story 3. This story is extremely sad and quite disturbing, so I should put a warning on it. Back when I was in 7th grade, I had a friend named Lazar. He was a year older than me and had 3 siblings, 2 of whom were much younger. He also lived fairly close to me. It's important to note that we lived in the countryside. One day while we were at school, the principal and teachers were in a panic, and some kids started crying. I asked someone what had happened and just stood there in shock when I heard. Lazar's father had been working in a field with a combine harvester alongside a friend. At some point, something got stuck in the rotary thresher. Lazar's father went to check it out. After a while, his friend, assuming he was done, restarted the harvester. But Lazar's father's clothing got caught in the machine, pulling him in. First, it crushed one leg, then the other. By the time his friend heard his screams and stopped the harvester, both of his legs had been completely torn off. Only his upper half remained intact. Lazar himself had to pick up what was left of his father and carry him to the car to rush him to the hospital. His youngest sibling was there, witnessing everything, though they were probably too young to fully comprehend it. Since they lived far from the nearest hospital, they had to meet the ambulance halfway to save time. Somehow his father was still alive, unconscious but alive. All the way there, Lazar had to hold his father in his arms, wrapping him in his own clothes and using his belt in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. You can imagine how deeply this affected him. His father passed away a few hours later. I was still at school when it happened. Story 4. Then there's the horror of being skinned alive, also known as flaying. Typically, the process begins by leaving the victim exposed to the sun for a day or two, causing severe sunburn. If it's winter or the weather's bad, a quick dunk in boiling water achieves the same effect. Next, they are strung up by their hands and a very sharp knife is used to make long, straight incisions. The burns help separate the skin from the underlying tissue. The skin is then peeled away from the muscle in large sheets using a heated blade. A skilled flayer could remove the skin with minimal blood loss, meaning the victim wouldn't bleed out. The most common cause of death in such cases would be hypothermia, as the skin is essential for regulating body temperature. If they were unlucky, they might instead succumb to sepsis, blood poisoning due to infection, which could take days. Throughout the entire procedure, the victim would be kept conscious. Story 5. This isn't the most horrifying incident I know of, but it's one that still haunts me. At my local water park, a 10-year-old boy, same age as me at the time, drowned. The way it happened still disturbs me. He went down a water slide, and at the bottom, where riders splash into the pool, there was a pipeline that sucked water back up to the top. The pipe had a grate on it, but the suction was incredibly strong. It used to pull kids toward it, and we all thought it was a fun game to try and swim away from it. Until one day that game turned deadly. The boy went under and got trapped against the grate. He couldn't swim away. He drowned and no one even noticed for 20 minutes, until his mother started looking for him. The pipe was about 6 meters from where riders landed in the pool, so kids kept sliding in and swimming to safety, completely unaware of what was happening just a short distance away. The thought of being so small and helpless, held underwater, unable to call for help even though it was so close, it's something I can't stop thinking about. Story 6. There was a Roman execution method known as the body of death. For anyone interested, this is actually the allusion the Apostle Paul makes in his letter to the Romans when he says, "Who shall free me from this body of death?" The punishment was often given to murderers. It involved sewing the body of the victim onto the back of the murderer. Over time, as the corpse decayed, the rot, disease, maggots, and bacteria would spread to the living person, slowly killing them in an agonizing way. To make matters worse, anyone caught trying to help the condemned person would face the same punishment. This is one of the reasons why Rome is often remembered as one of the most brutal empires in history. Edit. Many people have asked for historical proof. I'll admit my original source was more anecdotal, so I looked into it further. The closest legitimate reference I found comes from Virgil's Aeneid, Book 7, written around 30 to 19 BC. It includes the following passage. He even tied corpses to living bodies as a means of torture, placing hand on hand and face against face, so killing by a lingering death in that wretched embrace, that ooze of disease and decomposition. However, since Aeneid is an epic poem rather than a historical text, this account isn't necessarily factual. While it's possible that something like this happened, there's no solid evidence that it was a common legal penalty. Thanks to those who encouraged me to dig deeper. Story 7. This might sound like a bad joke at first, but it was actually one of the most disturbing things I ever experienced. When I was 16 to 18 years old, I volunteered with the fire department. Every so often, we would do courtesy checks on people whose out-of-town relatives hadn't heard from them. One day, we got a call to check on a guy in his 30s who lived alone. No one had seen or heard from him in a week. This was before social media, so long absences weren't always obvious. When we arrived, we saw that his mail had piled up. His door was unlocked. It was already a bad sign. We called the police and went inside with them. He had taken his own life. He left a note and everything. He had hanged himself from an exposed ceiling beam, and he had been there for about 5 days. But what was truly shocking was what time had done to his body. His feet were touching the floor, but his neck had stretched. Over that week, his muscles had loosened, and his skin had stretched so much that his neck had grown by nearly 1.5 feet. He looked almost surreal, like a human giraffe. It was one of the most disturbing things I had ever seen. We had to stay and help take him down before transporting him for an autopsy. Of course, being in emergency services, we coped the way we always did. Dark humor. It helped to take the edge off in the moment, but even after 20 years, I can still picture every detail of that room. Story 8. When considering the worst way to die, you have to take into account the pain scale, how long it takes, and what happens to the body. In my opinion, one of the most horrific ways to die, one that has happened to multiple people, is acute radiation sickness. Here's how it goes. The longer someone is exposed to ionizing radiation, the more it tears apart the cellular structure of their body. Skin blisters, turning red, then black. Then comes the latency period, where the immediate symptoms subside. The person appears to be recovering, even looking healthy, but they aren't. This false recovery usually lasts a day or two. Then the real damage sets in. The bone marrow dies, the immune system collapses, and the organs and soft tissues begin to break down. The arteries and veins start to deteriorate to the point where even administering pain medication becomes impossible. The agony is beyond comprehension. Death follows anywhere between 3 days and 3 weeks. A truly horrifying way to go. Story 9. This isn't my story, but a co-worker's. She's a paramedic, and one morning, just as the shift was changing, they got a call to a residential home. The radio call was vague, just that a wife had reported her husband was in the tub. It sounded like a routine, "I fell and can't get up" situation. She and her team responded along with the fire department. When they arrived, they found the wife standing in front of a bedroom door, completely hysterical, crying and barely able to speak, just repeating, "He's in there! He's in there! Oh, God!" They soon realized what had happened. The couple had gone out for the evening, and when they got home, the husband decided to take a quick dip in their indoor hot tub. His wife went to bed. Sometime during the night, he had a stroke while in the hot tub. His wife had no idea until she woke up the next morning, noticed the empty bed, and went looking for him. When she found him, he had been submerged in the scalding water for hours. When my coworker and the others opened the door, they saw something they would never forget. The man was still alive. He looked at them, and despite the pain, there was fear in his eyes. But his body had been exposed to the hot water for so long that every time they attempted to lift him, his skin peeled off. They had to extract him as carefully as possible, trying to minimize further damage. But there was only so much they could do. He later passed away at the hospital. That was one of the hardest days my coworker ever faced. She even questioned whether she could continue working as a paramedic after that. Story 10. This was a shocking tragedy when I first heard about it. It was all over the local news a few years ago, and then my mom called to tell me, though I had already heard, a head-on collision. A drunk driver had crossed the center line and crashed into a car carrying people I used to know. One of them was an old classmate from 4th grade, a brilliant girl. At the time of the accident, she would have been in her mid-20s. Her boyfriend was driving, and her younger sister, also in her 20s, was in the car with them. They were either on their way to or coming back from a party. They never made it home. The drunk driver hit them head-on. Their car burst into flames, and from what witnesses reported, the boyfriend had no time to react. The crash was instant. He was crushed in the impact, trapped as the fire engulfed the vehicle. My old classmate and her sister were still alive as the fire spread. According to the witness accounts, there were screams of agony before anyone could get close to help. The fire consumed the car before they had a chance. It must have been pure torture, one of the worst possible ways to die. And as it so often happens, the drunk driver survived. I don't know if he passed away later at the hospital, but honestly, I didn't care. This hit too close to home. She was such a kind person, the type who didn't deserve this. They say only the good die young. To put things into perspective, she was one of my good friends before she transferred to another school. Her mother was also a teacher, one of my favorite teachers, actually. That poor woman lost everything she lived for in a single night. Story 11. Stomach cancer. Your family has to watch you waste away. You lose control over your body. You become cruel and resentful. You fall and break bones. And when they surgically attach your esophagus to your intestines, they have to go in constantly with a giant tube to stretch the scarred tissue into a small pocket, just so you can hold a few crumbs of food. Even that hurts because the reflux is already burning holes inside you. You can never lie down again. Sitting at 90 degrees feels freezing. You stop feeling hunger and food becomes traumatic. Your family spends years begging you to eat. Just a French fry, maybe a brownie, even a protein shake. Please, just try something. If you don't overdose first, which is easy when you're popping Valium and using fentanyl patches but still can't sleep because the pain is unbearable, you'll probably last around 5 years. That's when people will congratulate you for beating cancer. I'd take being burned alive over this. Cancer is cruel, but stomach cancer is just evil. Story 12. Back in the early 70s in El Paso, Texas, one of our classmates, Jimmy Gutierrez, had a horse as a pet. He lived off the access road of what is now Highway 54 in the area between Hercules Street and Hondo Pass Road. One day he took his horse out for a walk, crossing the access road on the north side before leading it into the rocky dirt area between the two access roads. At that time, Highway 54 hadn't been built yet. Something spooked the horse. Because Jimmy had tied the reins around his wrist, the horse took off, dragging him across the rough terrain for nearly half a mile toward Hercules Street. By the time the horse stopped, he was already gone. Later that day, or maybe the next, we walked the path where he had been dragged. We found blood-covered rocks, bits of hair, and even fragments of his skull. But the worst part, his pants, underwear, and socks had all been ripped off in one violent swipe, still tucked into his boots. It was a horrific sight. He was just a kid, maybe in his early teens. Story 13. I'm not sure if this counts since I read it in a book for a class I took on World War II in community college. The book was The Third Reich at War, but this actually happened to real people, so I think it counts. The book described the fighting in the Balkans. I don't remember the exact country, but it detailed a Nazi operation where soldiers were sent into a town to eliminate certain groups. Jewish people, Roma, LGBTQ individuals, and others. However, they weren't allowed to use bullets because, believe it or not, The Nazis were worried about wasting ammunition. So instead, they corralled the victims near a meat processing plant, the kind used for cattle and pigs, and forced them through it, slaughtering them like livestock. They were hooked, skinned, dismembered, and gutted. If they weren't already dead, their throats were slit. Anyone who resisted was beaten to death or blackmailed by threatening their loved ones. Of course, those loved ones were eventually forced through as well. It was one of the most horrifying things I had ever read. Even now, I shudder just thinking about it. Story 14. I'm surprised no one has mentioned this yet. Train coupling. My buddy used to work in a rail yard and he told me about this. For those unfamiliar, train cars have massive coupling mechanisms. Huge, heavy-duty hooks and locks that connect the cars together. They're designed to latch when pushed together at low speeds. This also makes them one of the greatest dangers in a rail yard. If someone ends up between two train cars when they're being coupled, their body isn't enough to stop the process. The sheer weight of the cars means they will crush anything in between. This usually results in immediate death, but not always. The couplings sit at hip height, meaning the person gets crushed in half, but the pressure keeps everything together. They don't bleed out right away. When this happens, the rail workers set up a tent around the person and call their family, giving them a chance to say goodbye. The victim remains fully conscious, feeling everything, knowing that as soon as the trains are uncoupled, it will all be over. Once they pull the cars apart, the pressure that was holding them together disappears, and they fall apart instantly. Just hearing this messed me up. Imagine knowing exactly when you're going to die, feeling it, waiting for it. What a horrifying way to go. Story 15. I used to be a police officer. I saw this happen firsthand. A carjacker stole a vehicle and tried to evade the police. During the chase, he repeatedly stuck his entire upper body out of the driver's window, taunting us. Some of this taunting was happening at over 60 miles per hour. We assumed he had cruise control turned on. Eventually, he exited the highway and ended up in an industrial area. It was clear he didn't know the roads well, but instead of focusing on driving, he perched himself on the driver's door, steering with his left hand while throwing up gang signs and middle fingers at bystanders. He was still going about 40 to 45 miles per hour, seemingly with cruise control engaged. Then he made a left turn, completely unaware that the road was a short dead end that ended in a T intersection. Across from the intersection was a chain-link fence blocking access to a massive excavation site, a pit about 3 stories deep, being dug out for a parking garage for the city's new stadium. He sped straight through the intersection. The vehicle passed between an electric pole and one of the metal guide wires that secured it to the ground. As he turned to look ahead in the split second it took for him to face forward, the metal guide wire struck him. The force tore the skin off his face from his left cheekbone to his right eyebrow, peeling it back until it hung behind his head like a grotesque mullet. The impact yanked him out of the car, and as the vehicle plowed through the chain-link fence and plunged into the pit, he got tangled up in the debris of the fence and guide wire. There was a brief, eerie 10 to 15-second pause as my partner and I stopped and got out of our cruiser. He had just enough time to realize that he was literally holding his own face in his hands, touching his exposed skull. Then the weakened fence post gave way, and he fell into the pit, landing on the wrecked car below. By the time we climbed down, he was already gone. I don't know how long it took him to die, but I'm certain he felt every moment of it. Story 16. My grandfather was diagnosed with esophageal cancer. He never smoked a day in his life, yet he slowly starved to death. Doctors tried inserting a lining to help him eat, but it caused tiny, excruciating cuts inside his esophagus, so they had to remove it. He was also severely allergic to opioids, which meant he had almost no pain relief. Even his surgeries required a specialized anesthetic team because so many standard drugs were off limits for him. The only thing that gave him any relief were THC pills, which were incredibly difficult to obtain back then. Medical marijuana wasn't legal yet, so they could only be prescribed in pill form under very specific conditions, but he was vehemently anti-drug and refused to take them. His tiny, docile wife, barely 80 pounds, couldn't stand to see him suffer. She secretly crushed the pills and hid them in his food just to ease his pain. He was able to drink water until the very end, but he literally starved to death. He passed away at home under hospice care, with the family by his side. Story 17. I've researched this topic extensively, and most of the answers I've seen don't even come close to what I found. The first thing that comes to mind is scaphism, but I may have come across something even worse. During the Vietnam War, a U.S. Marine was captured by a sadistic female interrogator at a Viet Cong base, within sight of an American outpost. She tortured him systematically. She broke bones and tore ligaments throughout his hands, feet, elbows, and knees, not to kill him, but to make him scream all night so his fellow soldiers could hear. The enemy had set up an ambush, waiting to slaughter any attempted rescue team. Early on, she cut off his eyelids, ensuring he couldn't shut his eyes to escape the horror. By the end, she mutilated him beyond recognition. She cut off his genitals and then let him go, forcing him to stagger toward friendly troops, barely alive. He didn't make it much farther before succumbing to his wounds. A well-known American sniper was in the area and later managed to eliminate her. He killed countless enemy soldiers throughout the war, but he later admitted that hers was the only death that brought him any satisfaction. Story 18. I don't know if these exist anywhere else, but in Alaska we have something called mudflats. They're wide stretches of wet sand that extend for miles. You can walk on most of them, but there are certain areas you must avoid because you can easily sink and get trapped. People have lost boots, pants, even entire four-wheelers in these flats, and one woman lost her life. Locals use this story as a warning to stay off the flats. It's a very real, very tragic incident. One day, a woman was walking on the flats when she got stuck up to her calves. She struggled, trying to free herself, but only sank deeper, up to her waist. At that point, emergency services were called. A rescue team flew a helicopter out to her location. They wrapped some kind of harness or rope around her waist. I was a young child when this happened, so I don't remember the exact details, and tried to use the helicopter to pull her out. But the mud wouldn't let go. The suction held onto her lower body, and when the helicopter pulled, it ripped her in half. Her upper body was torn away while her lower half remained trapped in the mud. It was a horrifying, tragic mistake, and it's the reason most people stay far away from certain areas of the flats. Pro tip: if you're sinking in mud or quicksand, try to float on your back. Spreading your weight evenly can slow the sinking process and give you a better chance of escaping. Story 19. The Collier brothers died one of the most bizarre and disturbing deaths in modern history. Their apartment was completely filled with trash, piled from floor to ceiling. It was so cluttered that they even set up booby traps to kill any intruders, mainly to keep out police in the bank, as they had stopped paying for their properties long ago. The brothers, Homer and Langley Collier, lived in isolation, but would occasionally invite reporters inside to talk. Homer had a medical condition that left him blind and paralyzed, and Langley was obsessed with keeping newspapers so that Homer could catch up on the news once he regained his sight. Langley would also paint pictures based on the descriptions Homer gave him. Then one day, everything went silent. No one saw or heard from them again. Not even Langley ventured outside for food or water. Eventually, a foul smell started emanating from the house, and an anonymous tipster called the police to report a dead body inside. The police were used to false alarms with the Collier brothers, but a patrol officer was still sent to check. However, when he arrived, he physically couldn't get inside because of all the debris. A rescue team had to be called, and after 5 hours of digging, they finally found Homer Collier. He had starved to death. Langley, however, was nowhere to be found. At first, police assumed Langley had made the call himself and fled. They even stationed officers outside the house, expecting him to return. But he never did. As the investigation continued, police received sightings of Langley across 9 different states. Meanwhile, they continued searching the apartment. Over 120 tons of garbage was removed, watched by thousands of onlookers. Then on April 8, 1971, after weeks of searching, they found Langley. He had been buried under a collapsed tunnel of trash just 10 feet from where his brother had died. His body had been partially eaten by rats. He had been dead since March 9th. The cause? Asphyxiation. Police theorized that Langley had accidentally triggered one of their own deadly traps, causing the garbage to collapse on top of him. Unable to move, he suffocated. Homer, completely helpless, had been forced to sit in the decaying house, unable to escape, unable to call for help, until he starved to death. Story 20. That bar fire, I think it was called the Station, was one of the most horrifying disasters ever caught on camera. The entire building was burned to the ground in just a matter of minutes. Most victims died wedged in the doorways, trapped like sardines, stacked on top of each other, able to see the outside, but completely unable to escape. Being in that position, knowing the fire was racing toward you with no way out, I can't think of anything more terrifying. The screams in the footage were unbearable. And now, anytime I'm in a crowded place with narrow exits, I can't help but panic a little. One man survived only because he was trapped beneath the massive bodies, meaning the flames never reached him. But there were others in similar positions who survived the fire, only to drown from the water used to put it out. I don't know what would be worse, burning alive or slowly drowning in the aftermath. Story 21. A young woman was walking into town on a Friday night with her friends. She was crossing an empty two-lane road and stopped in the middle to let a car pass. It had the right of way. Her friend shouted, "Watch out!" But she had already seen the car and had stopped safely. She turned her head back toward her friend, and that's when she tripped. She fell forward in her heels, landing just a few meters ahead of the approaching car, which had assumed she wasn't moving. The driver slammed on the brakes, but the front wheels rolled over her legs. Then something even worse happened. Her body got snagged underneath the car, and as it decelerated, she was dragged nearly 20 meters. She was still conscious. An ambulance arrived within 5 minutes. The hospital was only 5 minutes away. She had no deep wounds, but 70 to 80% of her skin had been scraped off. As paramedics fought to stop the bleeding, blood began pooling around her. There was simply too much open surface area. She finally lost consciousness 10 minutes after being hit. Her heart stopped 5 minutes later. Story 22. During the Black Saturday fires near my hometown, a friend's husband got caught off guard and cut off by the flames. He was lucky. He grabbed whatever he could, dug a hole about a foot deep, took the scratchy wool blanket from his back seat, and grabbed a couple of bottles of water. He parked the car over the hole, crawled in, dampened the blanket slightly, covered himself with it, and prayed. The fire passed over him. He suffered minor smoke inhalation and burns but survived. His brother, in a panic over his newborn baby, made the desperate decision to try driving through the fire. 8 hours later, they found his car. He was still inside. Blinded by the thick smoke, he had crashed into a tree and became trapped. Unable to escape, he succumbed to the heat and smoke, slowly suffocating in the vehicle. Bushfires are incredibly dangerous. If you must travel near fire-prone areas, always know when to turn back and how to shelter safely. His wife, a volunteer firefighter with the CFA, holds an annual bushfire safety session at the local school, much to her daughter's embarrassment. But her experience proves just how vital this knowledge can be. Story 23. It's surprising no one has mentioned the infamous 2003 Darwin Award winner. Zookeeper Friedrich Riesfeld, in an effort to help his constipated elephant, Stefan, administered 22 doses of animal laxative along with a large quantity of berries, figs, and prunes. Eventually, the treatment worked. Too well. The elephant finally relieved itself, and in a tragic turn of events, Riesfeld was caught in the worst place at the worst time. Investigators reported that the sheer force of the unexpected defecation knocked Riesfeld to the ground, where he struck his head on a rock and lost consciousness. With no one around to help, the zookeeper was buried under the massive weight of the elephant's waist and suffocated before he could be rescued. A truly bizarre and horrifying way to go. Story 24. I work in food safety and was once pulled into a case involving a processing plant. A woman who worked in mechanical maintenance failed to come home after her shift. About an hour later, her husband called the sheriff. In this small company town, there wasn't much else to do, and she always came straight home after work. The sheriff drove out to the plant and asked if Jane had clocked out. She hadn't. After speaking to a few employees on a bridge shift, one person mentioned seeing a hard hat, labeled with Jane's name, come through the processing line. At that point, the sheriff ordered the line to be stopped. He and the plant manager began inspecting the machinery. To set the scene, this was a beet sugar processing plant. If you're not familiar with sugar beets, they resemble oversized, tough turnips. The processing line chops and shreds them to extract juice, which is then dried to create granulated sugar. The leftover beet pulp is used as livestock feed. As the sheriff and plant manager examined the line, they found fragments of clothing, a work glove, a boot, and a piece of hair still attached to a section of scalp. That was enough to conclude something had gone horribly wrong. After the sheriff left for the night, the plant foreman clapped his hands and said, "Break's over. Back to work." The plant, being the only major employer within a 60-mile radius, resumed operations as if nothing had happened. The final investigation report revealed that Jane had been leaning into a section of the machinery when she lost her balance due to a missing guardrail. one the company had previously been cited for. She had been missing and likely deceased for over 6 hours before her husband called it in. It still sends chills down my spine every time I think about it. Story 25. I nearly experienced a horrific accident myself. I have long hair, and I was working over a steam tunnel, lightly spraying brass parts. As I watched some work being done, I suddenly felt my head start to pull backward. At first it was slow, but then I felt a sharp tug, and I was being dragged with what was apparently 1 horsepower of force. My hair, which I thought was safely dragging behind me, had traveled around the edge of the machine and was caught in the seam plate. Panic set in immediately. I knew that 1 horsepower, if it had the torque, could deglove my scalp. And in that moment, I was absolutely convinced it did. The machine was set to a relentless crawl, and I was fighting to keep from being pulled in. Terrified, I grabbed my ponytail like a short rope and yanked with every ounce of strength I had, doubled over in sheer desperation. I wasn't just afraid of losing my hair. I was afraid of losing my face, maybe even my life. But pulling didn't work. My hair was thicker than the gap between the conveyor and the guard, and it was being pinched tighter with every passing second. My mind raced, my heart pounded, and then, somehow, I remembered exactly where all the emergency buttons were without even looking. I slammed my hand onto the red stop button, then by feel alone, found the reverse switch. I powered the machine back on, and thank God it spat my hair back out. 2 important lessons came from this. 1. Know where your emergency stops are. Look at them every time you pass. Think about the closest ones to your station. Hell, even learn where your coworkers' emergency stops are. Industrial accidents are brutal. Machines do not respect flesh. 2. Be aware of long hair and loose clothing. I rarely cut my hair. It has deep personal significance to me. But no matter how slow a machine is moving, rotating parts are always dangerous. I got careless because the conveyor was moving at a snail's pace, and that almost cost me everything. I'm incredibly lucky to be the one telling this near-miss story, rather than someone else telling the story of a guy who had the top of his head peeled away, inch by inch. Story 26. Several years ago, a popular late-night radio host in Germany named Domian received a chilling call from a policeman who shared a story from early in his career. About 30 years prior, when he was a young officer on patrol with an older colleague, they were dispatched to an apartment building after neighbors reported a strange smell. The odor seemed to be coming from the first floor, where an elderly woman lived alone. As they approached the building, they were hit with a scent reminiscent of freshly boiled pork, Kesselfleisch. Climbing the stairs, the smell only intensified. The landlord, who had a spare key, unlocked the apartment door. Inside, everything appeared undisturbed. They searched each room until they reached the bathroom, where they found the elderly woman, well into her 80s, lying lifeless in the bathtub. The water heater was still running, continuously filling the tub with near-boiling water. She had been in there for hours. It was later estimated that she had drawn a bath around 7 p.m. the night before. At some point, she must have used the heater to warm the water again, but then suffered a heart attack or similar medical event. Unable to turn it off, she remained submerged as scalding water slowly boiled her throughout the night. Since German bathtubs have an overflow stop, the water never spilled over. It just kept circulating, maintaining a dangerously high temperature. When asked what the scene looked like, the officer said that pieces of flesh were already floating on the surface of the water. After securing the apartment, criminal investigators took over to rule out any foul play. The only good news in this horrific case was that she may have lost consciousness before the worst of it. Story 27. I guess I'm late to the party. As a train conductor, we're constantly warned about the dangers of not following proper radio procedures. Every rule in our 250-page rulebook exists because of a serious accident or death. In a way, it's a book written in blood. One of the most haunting examples we were taught involved a tragic miscommunication in a rail yard. At the time, there were 2 locomotives with the same number designation in the yard. When a conductor radioed the locomotive engineer to confirm set and centered, which means the train is stopped and secured, a different locomotive crew responded with set and centered. The conductor, thinking it was his train, proceeded to go between the cars to adjust the drawbar, the mechanism that houses the knuckle used to connect rail cars. But the locomotive he was working on hadn't been secured. As he worked, the train suddenly backed up, pinning his body between 2 knuckles. The crushing force was enough to kill him, but not instantly. The pressure of the knuckles kept him alive, preventing him from bleeding out or going into shock too quickly. He remained conscious long enough to call his family, say his goodbyes, and even request a priest. But the moment they pulled the cars apart, he succumbed to his injuries. Because of this tragedy, the rulebook was changed. Now, whenever a conductor receives a set and centered confirmation, they must repeat the locomotive's designation. If it doesn't match, the mistake can be caught before it's too late. A small but vital change, one that ensures no one else has to die the way he did. Story 28. I worked for the railroad for a few years, and every now and then, you'd hear horror stories about people getting seriously injured or killed. But the worst thing I can think of is when someone gets coupled up. This happens when a person is caught between the couplers of two train cars as they connect. It's happened more than once, and the victim doesn't always die immediately. During a safety briefing, I was once told about a guy who got coupled up but remained fully conscious the entire time. He knew he was dying, but he wouldn't actually pass until they separated the cars. So they called his family, brought them in to say their goodbyes, and once the train cars were pulled apart, he died right there in front of everyone. I can't imagine witnessing something like that. There are also stories about people getting crushed between cars while riding the point during a shove. If there are cars on an adjacent track that aren't fully clear and the cars collide, the person riding between them gets crushed. It usually happens at night, and when it does, it's always a tragedy. As someone else once said, there is no good way to die at work. But I'm grateful for OSHA because accidents like these used to be far more common before stricter regulations were in place. Story 29. This might not fall into the painful category, but then again, maybe it does in a different way. In 2008, I was in Afghanistan on my third deployment. First time there, after 2 tours in Iraq. One day on patrol, we started hearing gunfire. We couldn't locate the source quickly enough. And before we knew it, my buddy, who was standing just 4 or 5 feet from me, took a round to the back. It was fatal. The worst part, the part that still haunts me, was that he was completely conscious. We did everything we could to save him, but we knew, and so did he. I will never repeat the things he said, but the look in his eyes said it all. He knew he was dying, and he couldn't accept it. He had a family, a wife, a young daughter. He was funny, respectful, and full of life. And in those final moments, as the blood drained from his body, he was fully aware that he would never see them again. That image is burned into my mind. It always will be. I've lost brothers before, but this was different. This was personal. I believe that moment is what triggered my PTSD. If I had a choice, I'd take drowning in lava, oil, anything, over lying on the ground for 5 or 6 minutes. Fully conscious, knowing I was going to die at the hands of an enemy at just 22 years old. Absolutely terrifying in every conceivable way. Story 30. A mostly healthy, alert, and oriented 94-year-old woman at my nursing home developed gout. She was prescribed medication, but no one knew she was allergic to it. It was her first time taking it. It started with her skin turning bright red. Then it peeled, all of it. Her eyelids, the inside of her mouth, her genitals, her entire body. The skin simply sloughed off. She had a habit of refusing care and wouldn't let us change her briefs, even as she soaked through them. Unfortunately, with her skin compromised, this made things much, much worse. The skin on her lower back became one giant open wound. She developed a pressure sore on her leg. We propped her heels up to relieve the pressure, but she would only lie on her back. The wound on her leg went full necrotic, and as any doctor will tell you, never go full necrotic. The infection spread to the bone, causing osteomyelitis in both her tibia and fibula. At that point, her family decided on hospice care. She lingered for another month before passing away. I've seen a lot of deaths in my career, but hers was, without a doubt, the worst. She suffered a lot. Story 31. I saw something on 1000 Ways to Die a few years ago that still sticks with me. According to the show, which changes names to protect identities, a tattoo artist once had a client who wanted a tattoo in Chinese. That alone is usually a red flag, but we'll get back to that. At the same time, the artist was feeling jealous because his coworker was getting all the attention after getting a new piercing. Wanting to one-up her, he decided to do something extreme. The next day, he showed up at the shop, having swallowed a thin chain, passed it through his system, and then connected both ends, effectively creating a continuous loop through his entire digestive tract. That same day, the angry client came back, furious after discovering that his tattoo didn't mean what he thought it did. An argument broke out, which quickly escalated into a street chase. The tattoo artist ran, eventually hiding behind a stack of boxes in an alley. Unfortunately, fate had other plans. A forklift passing by snagged the chain, yanking it with brutal force. In an instant, his insides were torn apart, killing him. Now, I can't say how much of this was dramatized for TV, but the documented death, that part was real. Story 32. This happened to a distant relative of mine, a great-great-uncle, one of the early pioneers in my family who settled in Canada. It was a cold day when the windmill needed maintenance. He asked one of his brothers to help, but for whatever reason, none of them were available, so he took his sister instead. While working on the repairs, the old man's scarf got caught in the windmill's mechanism. In an instant, it yanked him by the neck, lifting him into the air. His sister, unfamiliar with the windmill's workings, had no idea how to stop it. All she could do was watch in horror as her brother was pulled through the rotation, again and again, strangling a little more with each pass. She wasn't strong enough to get him down on her own, so she had to run for help. By the time the rest of the family arrived, it was too late. He had been spinning in that machine for far too long. I don't know all the details, but one thing is for sure. He didn't stand a chance. Story 33. Collapsing a lung and having the escaping air pressurize your chest cavity until your heart explodes or your remaining lung collapses from the pressure. Depending on the severity of the tear, this can take minutes or drag out for hours. This is my greatest fear because at 10 years old, it happened to me. I was saved by an EMT, but the pain was beyond anything I can describe. Imagine an elephant sitting on your chest, making it impossible to breathe. Now add someone slowly increasing the weight with every breath, while another person shoves a scalding hot knife into your ribs and twists. That's what it felt like. Survival depends on immediate treatment and an obscene amount of morphine, enough to knock you unconscious or put you into a medically induced coma. If done quickly enough, the lung can sometimes heal on its own, like a cut. But if you're awake, gasping for air, screaming in pain, your body's desperate attempts to breathe can actually speed up your death. The other way to survive is by having a chest tube inserted, piercing through your ribs and into your chest cavity to vent the escaping air. This prevents your heart from being squeezed to death by the pressure. The catch? They have to do it while you're conscious, so they know it's working. It doesn't fix the pain of the collapsed lung, and it leaves permanent scarring. I was lucky. I passed out before the pressure in my chest got too high. Being in a medically induced coma gave my body time to absorb the excess air. But rapid, panicked breathing? That's what kills most people. Now, I live with one lung that functions normally and another that never fully expands. I also have chronic pain on that side every single day. Doctors told me that if I ever take a hard hit to the chest, the same tear could reopen. It's a constant reminder of what happened, but at least I'm still here. Story 34. There are some shocking and terrible ways to die in this thread. Nightmare fuel for days, but for me, it became personal. People from my high school class, and those a couple of years before me, knew someone who was killed in the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando. He died after throwing himself on top of someone else to shield them. I was good friends with his younger brother in junior high. His family was devastated, as were all who knew them. What makes this even worse for me is that with every new mass shooting, it hits a little closer to home. Watching someone I once knew become just another statistic on the internet, another name in a growing list of senseless deaths, angers me beyond words. I'm not here to start a political debate, but I've lost all hope that anything will ever be done to stop this from happening again. One side wants to take away all guns. The other side tells them to go to hell and deflects with straw man arguments like, but we don't blame cars for drunk drivers, or shifts the focus to mental health. The fact is, I don't care how it's fixed, but something has to change. Our kids are afraid to go to school. People aren't safe while shopping or just going out for the night. But nothing changes, and I don't think it ever will. That's what truly terrifies me. Story 35. I didn't witness this firsthand, but at a manufacturing plant where I used to work, they warned every new employee about the dangers of the machines by telling the story of a guy who ignored safety precautions. The machine in question was a corrugating machine, a massive piece of equipment that flattens materials into precise sheets. The rollers are essentially two enormous cylinders built to withstand extreme pressure. They don't stop. They don't give way. This worker had a bad habit of getting too close to the rollers while feeding him material. He had been warned, but he didn't listen. And one day, it happened. It's unclear whether it was his hand or his sleeve that got caught first, but once it did, there was no stopping it. Those rollers move slowly, about 2 to 3 inches per second, but they never stop. Some say he was crushed all the way up to his shoulder before the machine was shut down. Others say it stopped somewhere around his upper arm. But here's the worst part. These rollers are huge. They weigh thousands of pounds and are locked in place with bolts. Disassembling them would take heavy lifting machinery and hours of work. That wasn't an option. So instead, they had to reverse the rollers to free him. His arm was completely flattened, squished down to about 5 millimeters thick. I don't know if he survived, but I do know that if he did, he would have experienced some of the worst pain imaginable. I never looked at those machines the same way again. Story 36. I just finished a school report on the Theric 25, a dual-mode electron X-ray beam used for radiation treatment. It was a disaster of a machine, responsible for multiple radiation overdoses due to software errors. The worst case I read about was this. A patient undergoing his 9th radiation treatment felt something immediately wrong during the session. He described it as an electric shock, like someone had dumped boiling hot coffee onto his back. He felt a thump, intense heat, and heard a strange buzzing sound. Since this wasn't his first treatment, he knew this wasn't normal. Panicking, he began getting off the treatment table to seek help, just as the operator unknowingly proceeded with the session. The patient suddenly felt an unbearable shock through his arm. So severe, he said it felt like his hand was leaving his body. He stumbled to the door, pounded on it, and the operator, realizing something was wrong, let him out. A doctor examined him right away. He had an intense burn mark, but they assumed it was just an electrical shock and sent him home, telling him to return if he experienced any further issues. That same day, the hospital physicist checked the machine and found it operating within specifications. The software error wasn't understood, and the machine continued treating patients for the rest of the day. What really happened was far worse than anyone realized. Due to a catastrophic software glitch, the machine had delivered an insane overdose, somewhere between 16,500 to 25,000 rads, in less than 1 second. That's hundreds of times the lethal dose. Over the following weeks, the patient's condition rapidly deteriorated. His pain worsened, and he lost function in his left arm. Soon, both legs became paralyzed. His left vocal cord failed, leaving him unable to speak. His organs began to fail. He developed radiation-induced myelitis in his spinal cord, causing irreversible neurological damage. By the time they realized what had happened, it was too late. 5 months later, he died from complications of the overdose, all because of a simple software error. Story 37. I work in the merchant marine, and I've heard some horrible stories about ways people have died in this industry. But one of the worst I ever heard was about a guy who got caught in a mooring line. Mooring operations are incredibly dangerous. The lines we use are under extreme tension. If they snap, they can cut a person in half in an instant. But this story was different. This guy got tangled in the line as it was being pulled onto the dock. The truck onshore was hauling the line to secure it to the bollard, and it passed through what's called a rolling chock. A rolling chock is a reinforced metal guide that prevents the line from rubbing against the hull and wearing down over time. It's tight, just big enough for the line to pass through. He didn't make it through. The force yanked him toward the rolling chock, and before he could escape, he was pulled through it. The space was far too small for a human body to pass through, so when he hit it, the inevitable happened. He was flattened, forced through the gap under extreme pressure, and came out in chunks on the other side. I heard this story over a year ago, and yeah, I know that sea stories tend to get exaggerated, but the thought of it alone is enough to turn my stomach. I love my job, but damn, sometimes it scares the hell out of me. Story 38. My mother spent 4 years dying in a nursing home. She had a stroke that left her almost completely paralyzed, except for one functioning hand. She was mostly deaf, nearly blind, and completely dependent on others for everything. Food, hygiene, even basic movement. She couldn't watch TV or engage in conversation. She had no way to distract herself from her own suffering. The nurses did what they could, but bed sores still formed. Diaper rash became infected. She even broke her nose falling out of bed. And to make it all worse, her brain damage blurred the line between dreams and reality. If she had a nightmare, say, being attacked by bats, she believed it was happening. She would scream in terror, sobbing, trapped in a horror she couldn't wake up from. She lingered like that for 4 years. What finally killed her was gangrene. It started in her feet, and by the end, the stench of her rotting flesh was so unbearable that the nurses lit scented candles to try and mask it. It didn't work. She spent her last days begging us to take off her shoes. She thought her pain was coming from shoes that were too tight. In reality, her own body was rotting beneath her. If I had known it would end like that, I would have taken a brick and put her out of her misery. Instead, we let her die in the loving care of medical professionals, dragging out her suffering in the name of keeping her alive. If she had been a dog, we would have been arrested for cruelty. But because she was human, we let her be tortured to the bitter end. Euthanasia isn't a crime, it's a mercy. Story 39. This is borderline true from Taxicab Confessions. When a guy gets hit by a train, not run over, but trapped between the platform and the train, it's one of the worst ways to go. You know how someone stands too close to the edge? If they fall in at the wrong moment, the incoming train spins them around, twisting their body in ways you can't even imagine. The train essentially holds them together. Now here's the horrifying part. As long as the train stays in place, they're alive. Their heart is still beating, their brain is functioning, and they can even talk. But the moment we push that train off, their body gives in. Their lower half, which has been unnaturally contorted, snaps back. Their internal organs spill out, and within minutes, they're gone. One time we had a priest come in, along with the man's wife. We cleared out the entire train station and left her down there with the priest. She had a chance to hug him, kiss him, and say whatever she needed to before we did what had to be done. It was brutal, but at least she got to say goodbye. Story 40. Scaphism, the milk and honey torture method. This method was one of the cruelest forms of execution in history, designed to prolong suffering as much as possible. The victim was trapped between two small boats or hollowed-out tree trunks, leaving only their head, hands, and feet exposed. From there, they were force-fed a mixture of milk and honey, which was also smeared all over their body. The process had to take place in a swamp or another sun-exposed area. The idea was that the sweet mixture would attract every insect, vermin, and scavenger in the vicinity. Before long, flies, rats, and other creatures would descend, drawn to the sticky substance, and inevitably they would begin eating not just the honey, but also the victim. As if being devoured alive wasn't horrific enough, the victim also suffered from severe diarrhea due to the forced diet, but death wouldn't come quickly. Because they were continuously fed milk and honey, they couldn't succumb to dehydration, ensuring they remained alive for days or even weeks while trapped in their own filth. Over time, their waste would accumulate in the space between the boats, breeding maggots and other vermin that eventually burrowed into their body, consuming them from the inside. This internal infestation was what ultimately killed them. When the boats were finally separated, what remained was a half-eaten, unrecognizable husk of a human. Story 41. Back when I worked in construction, I heard some horrifying stories from the JWs about a place they only referred to as the foundry. If you don't know, a foundry is where metal is refined and handled in molten form, one of the most dangerous work environments imaginable. One story was about a guy who was trying to get his life back together. Within his first month on the job, he was working with a crane-lifted bucket filled with molten metal. For some reason, one of the joints on the bucket failed. The bucket tilted, and he ended up directly underneath the pouring metal. According to witnesses, the only thing left of him were his charred legs and the remnants of his boots. Another story involved a low-lift operator who accidentally splashed molten metal into the cab. The burning liquid landed right in his lap. He ran from the vehicle, screaming in agony. No one knows exactly what happened to him afterward, but every time the foundry came up in conversation, there was an undeniable sense of dread. Even experienced workers warned apprentices to stay far away from that place. Story 42. New York City steam death. According to NYC medical examiner Judy Melinek, one of the most common questions medical examiners get is, "What's the worst way to die?" Dr. Judy Melinek usually responds, "You don't want to know." But when people insist, she tells them about Sean Doyle. Around Christmas 2002, Doyle, a bartender, was out drinking with his friend Michael Wright and Wright's girlfriend. At some point during their walk home, Wright became convinced that Doyle was hitting on his girlfriend. Witnesses later reported seeing a man getting viciously beaten, with Doyle allegedly screaming, "No, don't break my legs!" Another witness saw someone throw Doyle down an open manhole. It was an 18-foot drop. Below, a broken steam main had filled the tunnel with scalding water. Doyle didn't die immediately. In fact, when first responders arrived, he was still standing, reaching up and screaming for help. But the tunnel was too hot for anyone to climb down. A Con Edison supervisor later confirmed the temperature inside the tunnel was around 300 degrees. 4 hours later, rescuers finally recovered his body. Its temperature was recorded at 125 degrees, but that was only because the thermometer couldn't measure anything higher. During the autopsy, Melinek described his body as having been steamed like a lobster. His entire outer layer of skin had peeled off, and his internal organs were literally cooked. He had no broken bones, no head trauma, meaning he was fully conscious as he boiled to death. Melinek later wrote, "The worst nightmares I ever had in my 2 years at OCME came after I performed the post-mortem examination of Sean Doyle." Story 43. I heard this story recently from my professor, who personally knew the guy. There was a 20-year-old kid named Lewis Whelan who worked deep in the brush of Canada, clearing foliage around hydro poles. One day, the crew misjudged a tree's fall, and it knocked out a power line. One of the cables snapped and struck Lewis 3 times before everything around him burst into flames. When they got him to the hospital, he had suffered such severe burns that he needed a triple amputation and extensive skin grafts. Doctors said his arm could be pulled off like a drumstick. He eventually left the hospital and lived alone, but the suffering never really stopped. Then the 2003 blackout happened. Because of his skin grafts, Lewis had lost the ability to sweat and needed constant temperature regulation. When the power went out, his apartment became unbearably hot, and he had no way to cool down. He overheated and died alone, unable to call for help. His parents tried to reach him, but they lived far away. They ran out of gas midway and, due to the blackout, couldn't find a way to refuel. With communications down, there was nothing they could do. A miserable, tragic end. Story 44. When trains couple, there are rare but tragic instances where a person can end up trapped between the cars. At that point, survival is impossible. Their body is compressed so tightly that, while their upper half can still circulate blood, they are already beyond saving. When this happens, emergency responders erect a tent around the victim to give their loved ones a chance to say goodbye before the train cars are separated. The separation process itself is fatal, as it releases the pressure keeping them intact. To make it as humane as possible, doctors usually administer an anesthetic to render them unconscious before the inevitable. What makes this death so uniquely horrifying isn't the physical pain. It's the psychological torment. The victim knows they are already dead. There is no hope, no chance of survival. They are fully aware that they will never get to do anything ever again. The only small mercy is that they have a few final hours to say what they need to before they go. Personally, I would rather die instantly. Story 45. My father, now retired, was a firefighter. One of his first calls over 40 years ago was a car accident straight out of Final Destination. No one could say for certain how the chain of events played out, but his best guess was that the driver, a real estate agent, had a heart attack while on a bridge, lost control of the car, and went over the edge, crashing onto the train tracks below. Inside the car, he had a stack of real estate signs, and when the vehicle landed, the impact sent one straight through the driver's seat, impaling him. Then, as if that wasn't bad enough, a train was passing through at that exact moment and slammed into the wreckage. Another theory was that he lost control first, went over the bridge, suffered the heart attack mid-fall, got impaled by the sign, and then was hit by the train. My dad swears it really happened, and I have no reason to doubt him. What's even crazier is that, somehow, the car didn't burst into flames. Either way, fate had it out for this guy. Story 46. I used to work at a mining site, and one accident still haunts me. The process was simple. Big rocks were brought up in a skip to the mill, where they were crushed and put into giant spinning mills, massive steel tubes filled with either steel balls, about the size of a fist, or rods that helped to grind the rocks into dust. Because these mills required frequent maintenance, safety procedures were strict. Before anyone entered, they placed a padlock on the switch to prevent the machine from being turned on. There was also a system where multiple locks could be placed on the same switch, ensuring that no one could remove their lock until everyone was out and safe. One worker made a fatal mistake. He was supposed to be changing the interior plates on ball mill number 3, but accidentally locked out the switch for number 4 instead. The mill was then loaded with lead ore and powered up.